July 15th, 1943. The Texas sun beat down on the rolling plains near Hearne, where barbed wire stretched for miles in neat, geometric lines. Inside those fences were 800 Japanese prisoners of war, captured in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea campaigns, shipped across the Pacific under guard, and now locked in a world they had never imagined. Their first night had been the strangest. Lieutenant Kenji Sato, a naval officer who had once manned the bridge of a destroyer, lay awake in the barracks. At first he thought he heard gunfire in the distance, a staccato rhythm, bursts of crackling that reminded him of anti-aircraft tracers. Some men bolted upright, whispering in fear. Others froze, convinced the camp was under attack. But then the sound shifted. It wasn't gunfire at all. A melody drifted through the air, carried on unseen currents. Violins, trumpets, a woman's voice singing in English. It was a radio. Sato sat up on his cot, blinking in disbelief. Radios were contraband in Japanese military prisons. The very idea of POWs being allowed to hear music was absurd. And yet here it was, American swing music, broadcast from a loudspeaker mounted on a wooden pole in the camp square. Benny Goodman, Count Basie, songs with rhythms alien to Japanese ears, bright and defiant. By morning, the disbelief grew. The Americans didn't just allow radios, they scheduled them. At precisely 7:00 a.m., every barracks filled with the crackle of announcements, music, even baseball commentary. The Japanese soldiers looked at each other in silence. Back home, radios were instruments of the state, tightly controlled. Here, they seemed to spill sound freely, as though America had an endless supply of voices to waste even on prisoners. Then came the second shock. On the fourth night, guards ordered the prisoners into the central yard. They were suspicious, wary, expecting punishment or roll call. Instead, a white sheet had been strung up between two poles, fluttering in the hot Texas breeze. At its base sat a whirring projector, manned by an American private with a cigarette dangling from his lips. When the machine clicked to life, light filled the sheet, and the first moving images appeared. Not war footage, not propaganda, a Hollywood comedy. Charlie Chaplin stumbled across the screen, falling over chairs, spinning his hat, making the prisoners laugh before they could stop themselves. Laughter. Real laughter. Bubbling up among men who weeks earlier had sworn to die before surrender. Sato felt something twist inside him. They were supposed to be broken, humiliated. Instead, they were being shown a world so casual with abundance that even captives were treated to radios and movie nights. It was impossible to reconcile. Japan had drilled into them that Americans were barbarians, cruel and unfeeling. Yet here were their enemies, giving prisoners luxuries Japanese soldiers on the front lines could only dream of. The whisper spread through the barracks that night. America has so much it can waste comfort on its prisoners. What chance do we have against a country like this? For the first time, Sato began to wonder not whether Japan would lose, but how soon. The mornings in Hearne always began with sound. The prisoners came to expect it, though expectation never dulled the strangeness. At exactly 7, a burst of static ripped through the loudspeakers, followed by a cheerful American voice announcing the weather in English. For Lieutenant Kenji Sato, it was almost unbearable in its casualness. Sunny skies, highs in the 90s, chance of thunderstorms by late afternoon. And now, the announcer's voice tilted upward, brimming with ease, as though there was nothing in the world worth worrying over. The Glenn Miller Orchestra. And then the brass came in, smooth and confident, echoing through the wooden barracks, where men sat upright on their cots, silent, disoriented. To some of the prisoners, the sound was a violation, noise they couldn't decipher, but others, especially the younger conscripts, found themselves tapping feet unconsciously. Sato hated that. The very act of enjoying enemy music felt like treason. Yet what unsettled him more was the sheer abundance it implied. Radios were rare in Japan, rationed, censored, their content dictated. Here, America spilled music, as if it were water, even to captives, especially to captives. The guards didn't seem to notice the effect. They strolled the perimeter with rifles slung casually, humming along to the tunes. To them, it wasn't psychological warfare. It was simply normal. That was what gnawed at Sato. What the Americans considered background noise, the prisoners considered a revelation. By the second week, the real conversations began. In whispers, under blankets at night, men asked questions that felt dangerous. How could a country afford to waste gasoline for trucks that delivered movies to camps? How could it broadcast music across a continent without choking under shortages? Most disturbing of all, what if the stories they had been told that America was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse, were lies? The movies only deepened the wound. Twice a week, the prisoners were marched into the yard after dusk, where the projector rattled to life and images splashed across the sheet. For many of them, it was the first time seeing cinema not produced by the Japanese government. Charlie Chaplin was the first shock. Sato remembered the helpless laughter of hardened soldiers, men who had faced death at Guadalcanal and New Guinea, doubled over at a man tripping on his own shoes. Laughter felt dangerous, as though it chipped away at the armor of pride. But it came anyway, rolling through the crowd until even Sato felt his lips twitch against his will. Then came the westerns. Cowboys on horseback, pistols flashing, landscapes so vast they looked like entire kingdoms compared to the crowded islands of Japan. The Japanese soldiers watched with awe. How could any nation with land like this ever be starved into submission? On another night, a prisoner who had studied English before the war whispered translations during a romantic comedy. For the first time in years, soldiers who had sworn to die for honor were watching two strangers fall in love, not for duty, not for empire, but for something frivolous, human, and free. It rattled them. Sato could see it in their faces. These weren't the monsters their commanders had described. These were people who valued joy enough to share it with enemies. Food became the final blow. Meals were monotonous but plentiful. Bread, potatoes, sometimes even meat. To men who had lived on handfuls of rice and dried fish at the front, the very idea of eating until full felt like blasphemy. One private wept quietly over a slice of white bread, muttering that his family back home hadn't tasted wheat in years. Sato tried to maintain discipline, to remind the men that this was humiliation disguised as kindness. But the truth was harder to ignore each day. While their comrades in the Pacific starved, the prisoners were gaining weight. Their skin grew less hollow. They were healthier in captivity than they had been in service to the emperor. The irony was unbearable. One evening, after a Chaplin reel ended and the projector clicked silent, Sato sat with Sergeant Nakamura, a veteran of China and Guadalcanal. Nakamura had been a pillar of resolve, always reminding others that surrender was worse than death. But tonight, his face was pale, eyes fixed on the empty sheet. "Lieutenant," Nakamura whispered, "do you think our country lied to us?" Sato wanted to strike him for the thought, wanted to shout the answer that every officer was trained to give, but the words caught in his throat, because, in his heart, he was beginning to wonder the same thing. The camp did not crush them with violence. It smothered them with abundance. Radios that played all day, movies that turned enemies into companions, food that filled their bellies. Books in the camp library, English, yes, but also Japanese translations donated by organizations Sato had never heard of. America's wealth seemed infinite, casual, relentless. And in the quiet of night, when the barracks went still, the sound returned. Static, soft at first, then voices. Radios playing low for guards on the towers. Baseball games. Music drifting across barbed wire like ghosts. It was not meant as torture, but to men raised on the myth of Japan's unbreakable spirit, it was worse than torture. It was the proof of something unthinkable. America had already won, not just on the battlefield, but in the very idea of what life could be. For Sato, the realization came like a fracture he could not mend. He had sworn never to doubt, but now, each laugh, each song, each reel of film widened the crack. If America could treat prisoners this way, he thought, then how impossible would it be to defeat them in war? He closed his eyes, the echoes of a trumpet drifting through the summer night, and, for the first time since capture, he did not feel anger. He felt fear. The days turned into weeks, and by late summer of 1944, the strangeness of camp life had begun to settle into a rhythm that was almost unbearable in its normality. The barbed wire, the watchtowers, the sentries with their rifles, these still reminded the prisoners of their captivity, but everything else eroded that illusion of punishment. It was the radios that never stopped. Always there, always humming. At first, the men thought of it as a kind of weapon, a subtle way to wear them down. But as the weeks dragged on, the music became part of their lives. They recognized songs now, could hum along, even without knowing the words. Some even looked forward to the weather reports and the crackle of baseball games, though most pretended otherwise. The contradiction burned inside Lieutenant Kenji Sato. He had been trained to believe the Americans were a decadent people, spoiled by luxuries, soft and incapable of enduring real suffering. And yet here they were, not only winning battles thousands of miles away, but also drowning their captives in luxuries that Japan could not provide even for its own citizens. One evening, after a dinner of beef stew, actual meat, tender and seasoned in a way that tasted like indulgence itself, the men shuffled into the yard for another film. The screen flickered, the projector whirring. This time, it was not a comedy, but something else entirely. A newsreel. The reel showed factories, miles of them, endless assembly lines where men and women churned out airplanes by the thousands, tanks rolling off belts like toys, ships sliding into the water with banners flying. The music was triumphant, brassy, and the narration, though in English, carried the unmistakable tone of pride. Sato watched the men around him, their faces, usually stoic, now twisted with disbelief. This was not propaganda designed to terrify. It was just fact. The sheer scale of it was undeniable. America was a machine that never stopped. He felt Sergeant Nakamura shift beside him. "Lieutenant," Nakamura muttered under his breath, "if this is true, the war is already lost." Sato silenced him with a glance, but the damage was done. He had thought the same thing. Later that night, whispers rippled through the barracks. Some men argued that it was all lies, exaggerated for effect. Others pointed out the impossibility of faking such detail. But the whispers all carried the same undertone: fear. The movies continued to blur the line between enemy and captor. The prisoners began to recognize Hollywood actors by face, if not by name. They began to anticipate slapstick gags before they happened. Laughter became easier. And then something happened that struck Sato like a hammer. One evening, during a particularly absurd chaplain sequence, he laughed out loud before he could stop himself. The sound shocked him more than the joke itself. He had laughed with the enemy, in front of his men. He wanted to tear the sound back from the air, but it was too late. Some of the men glanced at him, not with scorn, but with relief. If even their officer could laugh, then perhaps it was not betrayal. This was how loyalty crumbled, not with a gunshot, but with a smile. The Americans encouraged it without even trying. They handed out cigarettes, allowed access to English-language newspapers, even offered the chance to work for small wages in nearby farms and factories. Sato watched in disbelief as men volunteered for these jobs, grateful for the chance to do something, anything, outside the monotony of camp life. And when they returned, they spoke of things even more bewildering. One group described being offered pie by a farmer's wife, sweet and rich, more sugar in a single slice than they had tasted in years. Another told of children waving at them from porches, unafraid of the enemy soldiers. It was not supposed to be like this. Prisoners were meant to suffer, to starve, to feel the crushing weight of defeat. But here, defeat felt like a strange kind of mercy. Sato began to notice something even more dangerous. The men were forgetting the war. It receded into the distance, replaced by the rhythms of camp life, the anticipation of the next movie, the next radio program. For some, the greatest fear was not death or dishonor, but that the movies might stop. Yet Sato could not forget. Every night, when the barracks went quiet, He thought of home. He thought of Tokyo, battered by firebombs, of his family rationing rice and scraping by. He thought of comrades still fighting in jungles, wasting away from hunger and disease. And then he thought of himself, sitting here, full-bellied, listening to Glenn Miller. The shame was unbearable. But shame alone could not extinguish the doubt. It crept deeper each day. He found himself comparing, measuring, questioning. Why had their commanders told them America was weak, when clearly it was strong beyond comprehension? Why had they been taught that capture was worse than death, when life here was almost gentle? One night, unable to contain himself, he spoke to Nakamura again. "Sergeant, do you remember what they told us in training? That Americans were cowards, that they would never fight hard." Nakamura nodded slowly. His face was hollow in the dim light. "They were wrong," Sato whispered. "And if they were wrong about that, what else were they wrong about?" Nakamura did not answer. He did not need to. The silence said everything. The guards, oblivious to the storm brewing inside their captives, carried on with their routines. They played cards, joked, listened to baseball. They treated the prisoners with a mixture of indifference and casual politeness. To them, it was simple. The war was being fought elsewhere. These men were already out of it. But for the prisoners, the war was not over. It was inside them now, a war between what they had believed and what they now saw with their own eyes. Radios, movies, food, books, work, all of it chipped away at the myth of Japan's invincibility. And though no one said it aloud, the truth became harder to deny with each passing day. They were beginning to envy their captors. It was the envy that broke Sato most of all. He lay awake that night, the sound of faint music drifting across the camp, and wondered whether he would ever be able to return home, not physically, but mentally. Could he ever again believe in the old myths, after seeing what he had seen? The radio crackled softly, a trumpet sliding into a melody both haunting and beautiful. Sato closed his eyes. He did not want to hear it, but he could not shut it out. And so the sound lingered, pulling him deeper into a world he no longer understood. The first cracks inside the camp began to show in whispers. Whispers that a man had bowed too low when thanking an American guard for an extra ration of bread. Whispers that another prisoner had smiled too freely during a chaplain reel. Whispers that someone had hummed along to Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade when he thought no one else was listening. Whispers in Japanese carried more weight than shouts, and soon those whispers began to divide the camp more than barbed wire ever could. Lieutenant Kenji Sato felt it before he heard it, a tension, a heat in the air, like the charge before a summer storm. Men had always talked in the barracks, but now they lowered their voices even when speaking to close friends. Heads turned too quickly, faces hardened too fast. The camp was splitting in two. One side clung desperately to the Bushido code. They called themselves Gyoku Men of Honor and viewed every radio broadcast, every movie night, every moment of laughter as poison. "This is not kindness," one officer snarled during evening roll call. "This is humiliation." They give us scraps of their luxury so we forget we are prisoners. Never forget. We are captives. Our duty is to die, not to be entertained. But the other side had already slipped beyond reach. They laughed openly at movies. They argued about baseball scores. They even tried mimicking English phrases from the radio. They worked in American fields and came back with stories of pies, of children waving, of women who spoke without fear. These men did not see it as humiliation. They saw it as proof of what they had never been told. That America was impossibly strong, impossibly rich, and impossibly generous even to its enemies. Sato stood between them, torn down the middle. One evening in August, the camp erupted in violence. It began with a movie, a Technicolor Western, projected against the camp's makeshift screen. Cowboys rode across wide-open plains, revolvers flashing, horses galloping. The prisoners sat in rows, their faces lit by the flickering glow. For most, it was another night of escape. But to the Gyoku, it was betrayal made visible, their comrades laughing at foreign spectacle while Japan bled itself dry in the Pacific. When the film ended, the Gyoku struck. A group of them cornered a young sailor named Ishida behind the barracks. He was slight, barely 20, and had once spoken aloud about how he liked the music on the radio. They beat him with fists, hissing that he was dishonoring the emperor by smiling at enemy illusions. Sato heard the scuffle and rushed to intervene. He pulled the men apart, shouting, but the damage was done. Ishida's lip was split, his face bruised, his eyes burning with something worse than pain-shame. Not shame at being beaten, but at being caught liking the world beyond the fence. The next morning, Ishida was gone, found hanging in the latrine, his body swinging silently from a belt. His death shocked the camp more than any gunshot. Suicide was familiar, honorable even, but not like this. This was not a death facing the enemy. It was a death inside captivity, at the hands of other captives. The Americans, puzzled and uneasy, tightened security but made no sense of it. To them, the prisoners were docile, easy to manage, more interested in movies and food than in rebellion. They could not see the invisible battlefield tearing through the barracks, a war for the soul of every man. That night, when the radio played, many prisoners sat stiff, refusing to listen. Others leaned in, even closer, hungry for distraction, for a world that felt less cruel than the one they had left. The divide grew sharper with each note. Sato lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. Ishida's face haunted him. He had done nothing wrong, nothing more than smile at music. Was that betrayal? Or was the true betrayal the refusal to admit what everyone could see, that Japan had been wrong? But to think such a thought aloud was to invite a noose. The Americans, in their strange obliviousness, added fuel to the fire. They expanded privileges. They built a small library, stocked with English books and even a few Japanese translations. They began screening movies twice a week instead of once. And when Christmas came, they distributed packages, real gifts, wrapped in paper, chocolate, tobacco, even small trinkets like pens and notebooks. The shock on the prisoners' faces was immeasurable. Gifts for captives. Sato watched one man weep openly as he bit into a chocolate bar for the first time in years. Another clutched a notebook to his chest as if it were gold. For the Gyoku, it was the final insult. They gathered in corners whispering. Words like Hancho traitor and Inu dog echoed in the air. They began marking men who had laughed too much, eaten too eagerly, read too many books. They swore that when Japan won, those men would face judgment. But Japan was not winning. Rumors filtered in from new arrivals. Saipan had fallen. The Marianas were gone. Tokyo was burning. Every report stripped away another layer of certainty. The whispers that had once condemned laughter now sounded hollow in the face of undeniable defeat. Still, the Gyoku clung harder. If America had abundance, they said, it was because they were materialistic and soulless. Japan had spirit, and spirit would endure. They ignored the gnawing truth. Spirit could not stop 1,000 bombers, nor feed a starving family in Tokyo. One night, Sato found himself staring at the radio again, listening to a jazz band swing into a bright, careless rhythm. He thought of his comrades still fighting, their rifles jammed, their bellies empty. He thought of himself, sitting here, safe and full, his ears filled with music. The shame was endless, but so was the sound. He realized then that the Americans did not need to break them with whips or starvation. They broke them with abundance, with radios that played every night, with movies that made them laugh, with food that never ran out. And once broken, the prisoners began to imagine futures that had nothing to do with Japan, futures they could never admit aloud, but which haunted their dreams, futures where the war ended, and they somehow lived not as warriors, but as men. Sato did not know if such a future was possible. But he knew one thing. The Japan he had left behind was already gone. The war inside the barbed wire had revealed it more clearly than any battlefield could. The summer of 1945 began like the ones before it. The sun blazing down on the Texas plains, the radio crackling with swing tunes, the projector flickering to life twice a week. But beneath the rhythm of camp life, something heavy pressed in rumors. Rumors came in fragments from new arrivals and overheard guard chatter. Okinawa had fallen. Tokyo was burning. American bombers flew unchallenged over the home islands. The whispers inside the barracks carried a new tone now, not just disbelief, but dread. For every rumor that trickled in, a piece of the old certainty fell away. Lieutenant Kenji Sato found himself walking a razor's edge. He had built his life on duty, on the conviction that Japan could never lose. But the radios inside the camp told another story. They no longer played only music. News bulletins cut in, sometimes even read aloud in Japanese by bilingual announcers. And though the Gyoku scoffed, Sato could hear the cracks in their voices. On August 7th, the camp woke to a rumor too impossible to accept. Hiroshima destroyed in a single bomb. The prisoners scoffed, argued, accused the Americans of fabricating stories. How could a single weapon erase an entire city? It was madness. Lies. Impossible. But then came Nagasaki. When the news arrived, silence fell over the camp. Even the most fanatical men had no words. The idea of defeat had lingered like a shadow for months, but this was something else, annihilation on a scale no one could comprehend. That night, the Americans did something strange. Instead of a comedy or a western, they showed a newsreel. The prisoners sat in rows, the screen flickering, and saw images of their homeland reduced to ash. They saw rubble where once there had been streets, firestorms consuming neighborhoods, women and children wandering like ghosts. Some men turned their heads away, unable to watch. Others wept openly, shoulders shaking in the glow of the projector. A few hardened their jaws, insisting it was staged, but no one truly believed that anymore. Sato sat perfectly still. His face was stone, but inside, something broke beyond repair. He had expected to die for the emperor. Instead, he was watching the emperor's cities burn, powerless and safe in the hands of his enemy. He had thought capture was the ultimate humiliation, but now he realized there was a worse fate, survival without purpose. The next morning, it was official. The radio carried the announcement. Japan had surrendered. The camp froze. Men looked at each other in disbelief. Some sank to their knees. Others shouted, refusing to accept it. A handful collapsed in sobs. The world they had built their lives on, the world of honor, of sacrifice, of certain victory, had evaporated, with a few words carried across a crackling loudspeaker. For days, the camp was restless. Some men plotted suicide, determined to cling to Bushido even in the face of surrender. Others wandered aimlessly, muttering about family, about what awaited them in a homeland they no longer recognized. The Americans kept the fences locked, but offered no cruelty, no mockery. They simply carried on, as if the prisoners were now just men, not enemies. One evening, Sato found himself in the yard as the projector hummed to life again. A movie began to play, but this time, hardly anyone watched. The prisoners sat in silence, staring at the images without seeing them. What was the point of laughter now? And yet, halfway through, a single chuckle escaped from somewhere in the crowd, then another. And slowly, impossibly, the sound of laughter rose again. Not forced, not nervous, but real. For a few moments, the war receded, and men who had sworn never to smile in defeat laughed together at a tramp stumbling across the screen. Sato did not laugh, but he listened. He listened to the sound of his comrades, once warriors, now broken men, finding something human in the ruins. He realized then that radios and movie nights had not just been distractions. They had been glimpses of a world beyond death and duty, glimpses of a life his commanders had never allowed him to imagine. When he returned to Japan months later, stepping off the ship into a homeland flattened and starving, he carried that sound with him. The memory of music drifting over barbed wire, the flicker of Chaplin's cane on a sheet, the echo of laughter where there should have been only despair. It was unbearable. It was shameful. And yet, It was also undeniable. America had defeated Japan not only with bombs and machines, but with abundance, with radios that sang in the night, with movies that made prisoners forget their chains, with the quiet, terrible mercy of showing captives a better life than the one they had fought to defend. Sato never forgot. None of them did. And that was how, long after the guns fell silent, the war lingered on not in battles, but in memory.